November 13, 1942 was a Friday, a fact that unnerved the crew aboard the U.S. San Francisco. The previous day, the cruiser had suffered misfortune when a formation of 16 Japanese Mitsubishi Betty bombers launched a torpedo assault against ships of Task Group 67.4. Although 11 of the bombers were shot down and none of the torpedoes hit. One crippled plane plunged into San Francisco's after fire control station, killing an officer and 23 sailors. The other vessels in the task group escaped damage. Some of the crew hoped that this terrible incident had used up their bad luck, though the shadow of Friday the 13th loomed. They would need every bit of fortune available. That afternoon, an American reconnaissance aircraft sighted a Japanese task force under Vice Admiral Abe steaming southeast at high speed through New Georgia Sound, a passage sailors called the Slot. The force included 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, plus a cruiser and 14 destroyers. Admiral Richmond K. Turner, responsible for the American landings on Guadalcanal, quickly assessed that the Japanese likely had one of 2 aims: attack the withdrawing U.S. transports or shell Henderson Field, the island's vital American airstrip. Abe's battle line was only one element of a larger Japanese plan. After the shelling, 11 transports carrying 7,000 troops were scheduled to land on Guadalcanal. 6 bound for Cape Espinosa and 5 for Tassafaronga. If Henderson Field were silenced, the Marines on the island would be left exposed, facing capture or destruction. But before those troop landings could proceed, Abe's battleships had to finish their task and demolish the American airfield. The American invasion of Guadalcanal had begun in August 1942, representing the United States' first major offensive against Japan in World War II. To oppose Abe's approaching force, the U.S. Navy put together a screen of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers under Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callaghan, who flew his flag on the San Francisco. Callaghan's squadron was markedly outgunned, and Admiral William F. Halsey's Task Force 64 lay too far south to assist. Historian Richard B. Frank emphasized the disparity in firepower. An American cruiser's broadside of 8-inch shells weighed about 340 pounds, while a Japanese battleship could throw 14-inch shells totaling roughly 11,120 pounds. There was hope the Americans' torpedoes might make up some ground, but Japan held the edge there as well. Their ships carried more torpedoes and used the Type 93 Long Lance, which were faster and deadlier than the American Mark 14s, which were notorious for malfunctioning and often failing to explode even on contact. For more than 3 months, the Japanese had mounted constant pressure to drive the Americans from the area and wreck Henderson Field. The first major blow came on August 7th, when Japanese bombers struck the transports soon after the 1st Marine Division had landed. The night action around Savo Island on August 8th cost the Allies 4 cruisers, 3 American and 1 Australian, while the Japanese sustained no losses. On the night of October 11th, the Battle of Cape Esperance occurred when American cruisers and destroyers under Admiral Norman Scott intercepted a Japanese force north of Guadalcanal. The Americans executed a textbook maneuver by crossing the enemy's T and unleashed crushing broadsides, sinking a Japanese cruiser and a destroyer while losing 1 American destroyer. 2 nights later, the Japanese battleships Congo and Haruna blasted Henderson Field for over an hour and a half, leaving the airfield nearly unrecognizable to observers. Much of the naval fighting around Guadalcanal happened in the narrow waters between Guadalcanal, Savo Island, and Florida Island, a zone that became known as Ironbottom Sound because so many ships from Japanese, American, and Australian fleets sank there. Before the campaign concluded, more than 40 vessels would lie on the seabed in that area. The Japanese strike that night was judged among the fiercest yet, another savage attempt to destroy the Marines ashore. American transports anchored off Guadalcanal were ordered to depart despite having offloaded only about 1/3 of their cargo, including ammunition, artillery, and roughly 6,000 troops. Callaghan's task group escorted the transports away from the island, ensuring their safety on the first leg toward Noumea. Once the transports were clear, Callaghan swung his force back toward Guadalcanal. The American cruisers and destroyers steamed in column as they entered Lunga Channel. 5 of Callaghan's ships, including destroyers Cushing and Farenholt, or Fletcher in some accounts, light cruisers Helena and Juneau, and the heavy cruiser Portland, carried the new SG search radar. Callaghan planned to rely on this technology during the overcast night, though he has been criticized for not placing the radar-equipped vessels at the head of the column. The nearest radar ship, Cushing, was fourth in line. Callaghan, much liked and nicknamed Uncle Dan by his men, was joined in the group by Rear Admiral Norman Scott aboard Atlanta, a former Naval Academy classmate of Callaghan's. Scott possessed greater combat experience, having won a night engagement at Cape Esperance, but Callaghan served as flag officer, likely because he outranked Scott by about 15 days. In the early hours of November 13th, Helena passed Lunga Point at 1:24 a.m., and her SG radar picked up the Japanese formation. Radar returns at bearings of 312 and 310 at ranges of 27,000 and 32,000 yards. Indicated enemy destroyers, Udachi and Udachi, a little over 10 miles from Cushing, the lead destroyer in the American column. Callaghan ordered the column to turn right to a heading of 00 due north, intending to cross the T of the oncoming Japanese force. As the column executed the turn, the radar contacts clarified, revealing two battleships with screening destroyers and cruisers. Unfortunately, Callaghan's turn was not sharp enough to fully cross ahead of the Japanese formation, bringing the American line perilously close to intersecting it. At 1:42 a.m., Commander Thomas M. Stacy aboard Cushing reported seeing 3 enemy destroyers pass from port to starboard, though in fact only Udachi and Akatsuki were present. Those 2 Japanese destroyers had also spotted Cushing. Admiral Abe was taken completely by surprise. His ships had no radar, and he had not expected a night surface fight. Lookouts on his flagship had reported no enemy vessels, reinforcing his intention to carry out an unopposed bombardment. The battleships already had their Type 3 shore bombardment shells loaded in the breeches. At about 1:30 a.m., Abe had issued the order to aim at the airfield, but the report from Udachi of enemy ships changed everything. Gun crews on Hiei and Kirishima scrambled to swap bombardment shells for armor-piercing rounds. At 1:45 a.m., Abe told his captains to engage the enemy ships instead. Cushing swung to port to bring her torpedo tubes to bear and switched on the intership radio, TBS, to coordinate. Commander Stacy requested permission to fire torpedoes. Callaghan approved. At 1:45 a.m., Stacy ordered his crew to prepare to open fire and soon afterward resumed course 000°. The abrupt course changes from west to north disrupted the column's formation. The 3 destroyers astern of Cushing, Laffey, Sterrett, and O'Bannon, also turned to port. Atlanta, following behind them, had to make a hard turn to port to avoid collision, and San Francisco altered course to avoid striking Atlanta. Callaghan, puzzled by the maneuvers, radioed over TBS to ask what was happening. Atlanta's captain replied they were avoiding their own destroyers. Atlanta's tall superstructure made her stand out more than the smaller destroyers, and at 1:50 a.m., Japanese searchlights suddenly played across her port side. Atlanta's gunnery officer immediately ordered return fire, knocking out one of the 3 lights and striking a Japanese destroyer, possibly Akatsuki. Because she was the most conspicuous target, ships on both sides concentrated fire on Atlanta. A shell hit the bridge, killing Admiral Scott and all but one of his staff. And 1 or 2 long-lance torpedoes struck the cruiser, leaving her badly damaged and dead in the water within minutes of the engagement's start. Admiral Abe then directed odd-numbered ships to fire to starboard and even-numbered ships to port. What followed was utter chaos. Vessels mixed and maneuvered like small fish in a pail, and the confusion was so great that reconstructing the battle precisely has proven impossible. A participant likened it to a tavern brawl in total darkness. Leading the American column, destroyer Cushing engaged an enemy destroyer at roughly 2,000 yards, while her 20mm cruise targeted the enemy battleship. Hit repeatedly, Cushing lost power and slowed dramatically. Even in that crippled state, she launched 6 torpedoes at the enemy, but none detonated. Once a searchlight picked out her position, withering gunfire from both sides reduced her to a burning wreck. With power gone and fires raging, the crew had no choice but to abandon ship. Laffey, sailing just behind, loosed torpedoes at Hiei, but at such a short distance the weapons did not arm before striking. Almost immediately she ran into 3 Japanese destroyers and suffered repeated hits, a torpedo ripping away her stern while heavy shells from Kirishima finished her off. And as her crew escaped a magazine explosion in the blazing superstructure killed many, including her commanding officer. Close astern were Sterrett and O'Bannon. Sterrett, while dueling an enemy ship, was struck and lost her radar, her 5-inch batteries and steering, forcing her captain to steer by engines alone while he fired 4 torpedoes at Hiei that, like others that night, either missed or failed to explode. With Sterrett badly damaged and burning, her captain withdrew her from the fight and nearly collided with O'Bannon in the maneuver. Hiei's guns briefly trained on O'Bannon, but the angle sent those shells harmlessly overhead. So O'Bannon returned fire with her 5-inch guns and launched 2 torpedoes as she disengaged while the crippled battleship blazed. Admiral Abe was stunned by the sudden, fierce American assault that had punched through his destroyer screen to strike his capital ships. From his bridge, he grasped little of the action except that his flagship had been hit hard and was aflame under close-range fire. One American witness later likened the range to rifle shot distance. Hiei's condition was grave. Flames raced along her forward masts. She had taken scores of 8-inch and 5-inch hits. All light AA mounts and radio and signaling gear were knocked out, main battery control circuits severed, and secondary directors disabled. In the confusion, some of her 6-inch guns even fired on Japanese destroyers such as Asagumo, Murasame, and Samidare. At about 01:55, an 8-inch salvo from San Francisco jammed Hiei's rudder and flooded her steering gear. And San Francisco then shifted aim to 2 destroyers on her starboard bow, likely Udachi and Harusami, setting one ablaze before Captain Cassin Young ordered fire on the other. Amid the chaos, Atlanta may have drifted into San Francisco's line. 2 full salvos struck Atlanta's superstructure, and some accounts place Admiral Scott's mortal wound in that exchange rather than earlier, while Admiral Callaghan, when he realized the situation, gave conflicting orders that some captains obeyed and others missed. Captain Lawrence Dubose of Portland asked for clarification, and Callaghan's shouted reversal, "Give her hell! Get the big ones first!" was followed by a brutal reply from the Japanese. Hiei and the cruiser Nagara rained a deadly 3rd salvo of 14-inch shells onto San Francisco's bridge, hurling the navigator against a 5-inch mount and piling him amid spent shell cases as crews thought him dead, while additional 6-inch fire-wounded Captain Young, who later died, and a shell through a steel girder above Callaghan killed him and nearly his entire staff instantly. San Francisco's bow swung south as the battle raged. By then, only Commander Bruce McCandless and a quartermaster remained alive on the bridge, surrounded by corpses, shattered instruments, and wreckage. The ship had been struck some 45 times, was taking on water, several guns were out, and damage parties reported 25 separate fires. Yet gun crews that remained continued to engage Hiei, Kirishima, and a passing destroyer until McCandless, aware of the ship's desperate state, finally ordered a westerly turn and then a reversal to the east to hug the northern shoreline while nearby the destroyer Cushing. Leading the column had been pummeled, lost power, and slowed after firing torpedoes that failed to explode and was reduced to a blazing hulk whose crew had to abandon her. Further aft, the destroyer Fletcher watched helplessly as Barton blew up and Monssen took crippling hits. Though Fletcher's gunners did manage to set one Japanese ship afire amid the swirling disorder. In the confusion of so many ships, commanders elected to fall back eastward to gain a clearer picture of events. Using radar, Fletcher threaded cautiously through the scattered hulks in Ironbottom Sound, fired 5 torpedoes at a large vessel that may have been the cruiser Juneau but missed, expended her remaining tubes on other contacts, and then withdrew from the fight entirely, remarkably still undamaged, despite having been in the thick of the action as long as the other American destroyers. Aboard Helena, Captain Gilbert S. Hoover ceased firing at 02:16 hours when the enemy began to pull away, leaving 9 burning ships drifting in Ironbottom Sound. Hoover tried repeatedly to raise Callaghan and Atlanta, but got no reply, and believing himself the senior officer remaining, ordered the surviving ships to retire. The clash had lasted only about 41 minutes. In the engagement southeast of Savo Island, the U.S. lost 2 destroyers, Barton and Laffey, while the Japanese lost Akatsuki and Udachi burned until she went down. By 0300, Kirishima reported the fight as fierce and chaotic with heavy damage on both sides, and Japanese troop convoys that had planned landings that night turned back. At dawn, Marines ashore looked out over the Sound and saw wrecked and burning warships scattered among the islands. Atlanta still smoldered and drifted. Aaron Ward struggled to make way. Portland steamed in slow circles with a bent hull. And the hulks of Cushing and Monssen burned from within while Udachi still blazed. The tug USS Bobolink from Tulagi put out to help tow and salvage disabled American ships and to pick up survivors. Hundreds of sailors bobbed in the water north of Guadalcanal awaiting rescue. Though badly hit, several ships could still fight. Portland, despite a crippled steering, kept her main battery in action and, while circling, scored a hit on Udachi about 2,500 yards to her northwest. The 6th salvo detonated the destroyer's aft magazine and sent her to the bottom, a grim relief to men in the water and to Marines watching from shore. Around 6:30, the battleship's after turrets opened on Aaron Ward some 13 miles to the southeast. The destroyer managed temporary movement but lost power again within 20 minutes and came under dangerous salvos that fortunately did not score direct hits. And aircraft from Henderson Field arrived in time to divert the Japanese gunners while Bobolink towed the damaged ship into Tulagi Harbor. Aircraft from Henderson, successive waves of Dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo planes, pressed relentless attacks against Hiei, scoring at least 1 bomb and 1 torpedo in the first strikes and more hits in later waves. By mid-morning, even heavy B-17s joined the assault, and Hiei's captain reported multiple bomb and torpedo strikes. Admiral Abe ordered Hiei to beach on Guadalcanal, but whether Captain Nishida received or obeyed the order is unclear. The battleship, severely torpedoed, began to list and could not make the short run to shore. So by mid-afternoon, the decision was taken to scuttle her. Valves were opened and charges set as aircraft delivered further blows. Yet Hiei stubbornly remained afloat until nightfall. Atlanta's crew fought valiantly to save their ship, manning pumps, casting gear overboard and forming bucket lines, but after taking some 49 shell hits and a torpedo, losing her foremast and suffering damage to most of her 5-inch mounts, she could not be saved. Bobolink's efforts were ultimately futile, and by 2015, Atlanta sank 3 miles west of Lunga Point. Portland's situation, while serious, was less hopeless. Captain Dubose struggled to regain steerage using engines and sea anchors as the damaged stern drove her in circles, and crews watched Cushing and Monssen burn and sink into the oil-black water. With help from Bobolink against her starboard bow, Portland was steadied, and by Oro 100 on November 14th, she limped into Tulagi Harbor. Only 6 American ships remained seaworthy enough to leave Ironbottom Sound under their own power: Helena under Captain Hoover, San Francisco, Juneau, and the destroyers O'Bannon, Sterett and Fletcher, which steamed southeast toward Espiritu Santo, zigzagging warily and limited to about 18 knots because Juneau's torpedo damage slowed the group. As they withdrew, a Japanese submarine, I-26, slipped into firing position and launched torpedoes at San Francisco. The spread missed its intended target but struck Juneau, which blew up in a colossal detonation that left nothing but an oil slick and floating debris. Taking with her 683 men, including the 5 Sullivan brothers from Waterloo, Iowa, a loss that led the Navy to change policy and prevent family members from serving together aboard the same ship. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison later characterized the action as one of the wildest and most desperate naval fights since Jutland. American losses were heavier: 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 439 men lost, while the Japanese lost 2 destroyers, the battleship Hiei, and about 552 men. Crucially, however, Abe's planned bombardment of Henderson Field was thwarted, and the Marine air units based there remained operational and aggressive. Tactically costly for Japan, the failure represented a significant strategic setback. Admiral Abe was relieved of command after the action. In his reports, he exaggerated Allied losses and understated damage to his own force. Ikazuchi and other destroyers suffered worse harm than he admitted, and the loss of a battleship was a blow the Japanese Navy, unable to replace capital ships quickly enough, could ill afford. Admiral Osami Nagano, head of the Naval General Staff, recognized that such losses were unsustainable. Abe was reassigned on 21st December and retired the following March, while Captain Nishida soon also left the service. Admirals Callaghan and Scott did not survive the battle, but their leadership proved pivotal, and both were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor and later had warships named in their honor. When Japanese forces finally withdrew from Guadalcanal in February 1943, it marked a turning point in the Pacific War, and the courage and sacrifices of the U.S. Navy were widely acknowledged as crucial to that outcome.